When I opened that envelope, I discovered my own brother had been stealing my identity for 3 years, racking up $45,000 in debt under my name. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife could, but what came next would change everything between us forever. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support means the world to me, and I promise you won't want to miss how this unfolds. My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone calls me Maggie. At 67, I've learned that life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. After losing my husband Robert 2 years ago, I've been living alone in our 2-story colonial house on Maple Street, the same house where we raised our children and built 38 years of memories together. The afternoon sun filtered through my kitchen window, casting warm golden streaks across the checkered linoleum floor as I unpacked my weekly groceries. The familiar ritual brought comfort, arranging the cereal boxes in the pantry just so, placing the milk and eggs in their designated spots in the refrigerator. The house felt quiet, except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of children playing in the neighborhood park 3 blocks away. I had just finished folding the paper bags when I heard the familiar rumble of my Honda Civic pulling into the driveway. The engine sputtered twice before going silent. That old car had been making that noise for months, but it still ran reliably enough for my needs. Through the window, I watched my younger brother David climb out of the driver's seat, his movements unusually quick and jerky. At 45, David still carried himself like the restless teenager I remembered from decades ago. His sandy brown hair, now streaked with premature gray, hung slightly over his forehead, and his clothes, a wrinkled polo shirt and faded jeans, looked like he'd slept in them. Something about his posture seemed different today, more tense than usual. I opened the back door as he approached, keys jingling in his trembling hand. The summer heat had left patches of sweat under his arms despite the late afternoon hour being relatively cool for August. "Thanks for letting me borrow the car, Maggie," he said, avoiding my eyes as he pressed the keys into my palm. His fingers felt clammy and cold, despite the warmth of the day. "I really appreciate it. You know how it is with my truck acting up again." David's pickup truck had been acting up for the better part of 6 months now, which meant I'd been lending him my car at least twice a week. Not that I minded particularly. I rarely drove anywhere except the grocery store, the library, and Sunday church services. But today something felt different about the way he stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he couldn't wait to leave. "Of course, honey," I replied, studying his face. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and a thin sheen of perspiration covered his forehead. "Are you feeling all right? You look a little pale." "Just tired," he said quickly, already backing toward the street. "Been working extra shifts at the warehouse, you know how it is. Need to get home and shower before Sarah comes over for dinner." Sarah was his 22-year-old daughter, my niece, who'd been staying with him since graduating college last spring. A sweet girl who reminded me so much of David when he was younger, before life seemed to wear him down with disappointment after disappointment. "Tell Sarah I said hello," I called after him. But he was already halfway down the driveway, his sneakers making soft slapping sounds against the concrete. He raised his hand in a brief wave without turning around, then disappeared around the corner of Elm Street. I stood there for a moment, watching the empty street and feeling an odd sensation in my chest. Not quite worry, but something close to it. David had always been impulsive, even as a child. But lately his behavior had become increasingly erratic. Quick visits, nervous energy, always needing to borrow something or ask for small favors. Shaking off the feeling, I headed back inside to finish putting away the groceries. The house felt cooler now that the sun was beginning to set, and I could hear Mrs. Patterson next door watering her flower garden, the gentle spray of water against leaves creating a peaceful background melody. It wasn't until later that evening, when I went to retrieve my GPS device from the glove compartment for my planned trip to visit my sister in Albany the next day, that I discovered something that would shatter the comfortable routine of my quiet life. My fingers found the familiar latch of the glove compartment, and as it fell open, a manila envelope tumbled out onto the passenger seat. The envelope was thick, heavy, and sealed with clear tape across the flap. My name was written across the front in block letters that didn't belong to David's usual scrawled handwriting. But what I didn't know yet was that David had been planning something far worse than I could have ever imagined. To understand how we reached this breaking point, I need to take you back to where it all began. 3 years ago, in November 2022, my world crumbled when Robert suffered his fatal heart attack. One moment we were discussing plans for Thanksgiving dinner, and the next, paramedics were working frantically in our living room while I stood frozen in my nightgown, watching 40 years of marriage slip away. David appeared at my doorstep the day after the funeral, carrying a casserole from his neighbor and wearing a black suit that looked like it hadn't been pressed in years. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from grief or something else. I couldn't tell at the time. "Maggie, I know this is hard," he said, settling into Robert's favorite armchair without asking. "But you don't have to go through this alone. I'm here for you, whatever you need." Those words felt like a lifeline in my ocean of grief. David had always been the troubled one in our family, dropping out of college, jumping from job to job, his marriage failing after only 4 years. But in that moment, he seemed genuinely caring, mature even. The first request came 2 weeks later. Sarah, his daughter, needed emergency dental surgery that insurance wouldn't cover. $5,000. I wrote the check without hesitation, grateful to help my brother and my sweet niece, who was just starting her junior year at community college. "I'll pay you back by Christmas," David promised, gripping my hands with what seemed like sincere gratitude. The overtime shifts at the warehouse are really picking up, and Sarah's planning to get a part-time job to help cover expenses. Christmas came and went. No repayment, but David had a reasonable explanation. The warehouse had cut holiday bonuses due to budget constraints. He brought me a poinsettia and spent New Year's Eve watching old movies with me, talking about childhood memories until nearly midnight. It felt wonderful having family around during those lonely winter months. By spring 2023, another crisis emerged. David's truck transmission failed, leaving him unable to get to work. He stood in my kitchen, wringing his hands and explaining how missing shifts would mean losing his job entirely. "I hate asking you for more money, Maggie. I really do," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But $3,200 for the repair is all I need. Once I'm back to work steady, I'll start paying you back everything." Again, I opened my checkbook. David was family, and Robert had always said family comes first. Besides, I had Robert's life insurance money, his pension, and my own modest retirement savings. Helping my brother seemed like what Robert would have wanted me to do. The summer brought another request. $4,500 for a business opportunity that would supposedly triple David's income within 6 months. He'd partnered with an old friend to buy equipment for a lawn care service that already had several clients lined up. "This is different, Maggie," he insisted, pulling out a folder filled with official-looking papers and contracts. "This isn't charity. This is an investment. You'll get your money back, plus interest, once we're established." I noticed his hands shaking slightly as he showed me the documents, and his clothes smelled faintly of alcohol, even though it was only 2 in the afternoon. But his enthusiasm seemed genuine, and the idea of him having steady income appealed to me. The business failed within 3 months. David claimed his partner had stolen the equipment and disappeared. I never saw any police reports or legal paperwork about this supposed theft. But David seemed devastated. I couldn't bring myself to pressure him for repayment when he was clearly struggling. Throughout these months, I began noticing small things that should have raised red flags. David always seemed to know exactly how much money I had in my checking account. He'd make comments like, "That insurance settlement was really generous," or, "You're so lucky to have Robert's pension on top of your Social Security." He also had an unusual interest in my mail. Several times I caught him sorting through letters on my kitchen counter, explaining that he was just trying to help organize things or looking for bills that might need attention. At the time, it seemed thoughtful rather than suspicious. David frequently asked detailed questions about my banking habits, which branch I preferred, whether I used online banking, if I kept important documents in a safe deposit box. He framed these inquiries as concern for my security, suggesting I should be more careful about identity theft affecting elderly people. The most troubling pattern, though I didn't recognize it then, was how David always had perfectly timed emergencies that required immediate financial assistance. Every crisis came with supporting documentation, tearful explanations, and promises of quick repayment that somehow never materialized. By winter 2024, the requests had become more frequent and the amounts larger. $2,800 for Sarah's unexpected medical bills when she developed complications from wisdom tooth extraction. $1,500 to prevent his utilities from being shut off. Another $2,000 when his landlord supposedly demanded back rent or threatened eviction. Each time, David arrived with stories that tugged at my heartstrings and made me feel selfish for even considering saying no. He'd mention how Sarah was counting on him, or how losing his apartment would mean losing his job, which would mean never being able to repay me anything at all. Looking back now, I realized David had become an expert at reading my emotions and timing his request perfectly. He'd appear when I seemed particularly lonely or vulnerable, offering companionship and conversation before gradually steering toward his latest financial need. But everything changed on that August afternoon when I discovered the envelope hidden in my glove compartment. That manila envelope changed everything between David and me forever. The weight of it in my hands felt heavy, substantial, like it contained secrets that could destroy lives. My fingers trembled as I carefully peeled back the tape, and what I found inside made my blood run cold. Photocopies of documents spread across my kitchen table like evidence in a detective story. Credit card applications, loan paperwork, and bank account statements, all bearing my name, my Social Security number, my personal information. But the signatures were wrong, the handwriting unfamiliar yet somehow recognizable in its clumsy attempt to mimic my own careful script. The largest document was an application for a personal loan from First National Bank for $45,000. The signature at the bottom looked like someone had practiced writing Margaret Thompson dozens of times before settling on this version. The address listed was mine, the phone number correct, even my mother's maiden name filled in accurately. But I had never set foot inside First National Bank, let alone applied for such a massive loan. My hands shook as I reached for the phone to call David. The number rang 4 times before going to voicemail, his recorded voice sounding casual and carefree. "Hey, you've reached David. Leave a message and I'll get back to you when I can." "David, it's Maggie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need to talk to you about something I found in my car. Please call me back as soon as you get this message." 20 minutes later, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the caller ID, but when I answered, his voice sounded different, tighter, more strained than usual. "Maggie, hey, what's going on? You sounded upset in your message." "David, I found an envelope in my glove compartment with documents. Did you leave something in my car?" The pause that followed stretched on for what felt like hours. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and somewhere in the background, the sound of traffic or machinery. An envelope? I don't know what you're talking about. What kind of documents? His tone had shifted completely. Gone was the casual friendliness I'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. Now he sounded guarded, almost defensive. David, these are loan applications and credit card documents with my name on them. But I never signed these papers. The handwriting looks like someone trying to forge my signature. That's crazy, Maggie. Maybe someone's trying to steal your identity? You know how common that is with elderly people these days. Maybe you should report it to the police. The way he said elderly people stung more than it should have. But more troubling was how quickly he'd suggested involving the police. In my experience, guilty people don't usually recommend calling law enforcement. David, I'm asking you directly. Do you know anything about these documents? Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on an edge I'd never heard before. Are you accusing me of something, Maggie? Because that's pretty insulting. I've been nothing but helpful to you since Robert died. And this is how you repay me. By suggesting I'm some kind of criminal. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just trying to understand how these papers ended up in my car. Well, I don't know anything about it. Maybe you should be more careful about who you let borrow your car if you're going to start blaming family members for problems. The line went dead. David had hung up on me. I sat there staring at the phone for several minutes, replaying the conversation in my mind. His defensiveness, the way he'd tried to turn the situation around and make me feel guilty for asking questions, his suggestion that I was somehow to blame. None of it felt like the concerned brother who'd been helping me through my grief. That evening, my neighbor Emma knocked on my door. Emma Patterson was 65, a retired nurse who lived in the house to my right and had become one of my closest friends since Robert's passing. She had silver hair that she wore in a neat bob and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Maggie, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right with David? I invited her in and made us both tea while she settled into my living room. Emma had always been direct, a quality I appreciated even when it made me uncomfortable. What makes you ask that? Well, I've noticed him coming and going from your house quite a bit when you're not here. Usually on Wednesday mornings when you're at your book club, and sometimes on Sunday afternoons during church services. I wouldn't normally mention it, but yesterday I saw him coming out your back door looking rather frantic, I suppose is the word. My stomach dropped. What do you mean, frantic? He was carrying what looked like papers or mail, and he kept looking around like he was worried someone might see him. When he noticed me working in my garden, he practically ran to his truck. Emma's words confirmed what I was beginning to suspect, but didn't want to believe. David hadn't just been borrowing my car. He'd been using his access to my house to steal my personal information. Emma, how long has this been going on? Months, I'd say. Maybe since last winter. I assumed you'd given him a key for emergencies, so I never thought much of it, but his behavior yesterday was definitely suspicious. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times David had offered to help with household tasks, volunteered to bring in my mail when I was traveling, insisted on helping me organize my filing cabinet after Robert's death. How many opportunities had I given him to access my personal documents? The next morning, David showed up at my door unannounced. It was barely 8 o'clock, and he looked like he hadn't slept. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unwashed, and his eyes were bloodshot. Maggie, we need to talk. His voice was different again, not angry like the previous day, but pleading, almost desperate. I think we do. I agreed, stepping aside to let him in. He paced around my living room like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair and avoiding eye contact. Look, about those documents you found, I can explain everything. But then he crossed a line that would change everything between us forever. David's explanation came tumbling out in a rush of desperate words, his hands gesturing wildly as he paced from my living room to the kitchen, and back again. But what he told me wasn't an explanation at all. It was a confession, wrapped in justifications that made my blood boil. Maggie, you have to understand. I was trying to protect you, he said, his voice cracking with what I initially thought was remorse. These loan sharks, these people I owe money to, they're dangerous. They were going to hurt Sarah if I didn't pay them back, and I knew you had the money just sitting there in your accounts. So you stole my identity, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You forged my signature on loan applications and credit card forms. I didn't steal anything, David snapped, his demeanor shifting from pleading to aggressive in an instant. I borrowed against your credit, knowing full well that I'd pay it back with interest. You have more money than you'll ever need, living alone in this big house, collecting Robert's pension and your Social Security. What's $45,000 to someone in your position? The casual way he dismissed such an enormous sum of money stunned me into momentary silence. $45,000 represented years of careful savings, months of Robert's hard-earned pension, the security I needed for my medical care as I aged. David, what you did is called fraud. It's a felony. You could go to prison for this. His laugh was bitter and harsh. Prison? For helping family? For trying to keep my daughter safe from people who break legs when they don't get paid? You're being dramatic, Maggie. All you have to do is keep making the payments for a few more months until my situation improves. Keep making payments? I stood up from my chair, anger giving me strength I didn't know I possessed. David, I never agreed to take on debt in the first place. You stole my identity and forged my name. I won't be making any payments on loans I never authorized. That's when his mask slipped completely. The brother who had comforted me through grief, who had shared the childhood memories over cups of coffee, who had promised to always be there for family, disappeared entirely. In his place stood a stranger, whose eyes burned with resentment and barely controlled rage. Fine, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Then I guess we'll find out what happens when those loan sharks come looking for their money and discover that the person who borrowed it lives in this nice house all alone. The threat was unmistakable, and for the first time since finding the envelope, I felt genuinely afraid. Not just of the financial implications, but of the man standing in my living room, who had once been my little brother. The confrontation that would shatter our family came 3 days later, during our monthly Sunday dinner at Sarah's apartment. She had invited the whole family, David, his ex-wife Linda, their son Michael, who was visiting from college, and me. It was supposed to be a celebration of Sarah landing her first full-time job as a graphic designer. Sarah had prepared a beautiful meal of pot roast and vegetables, the same recipe our mother used to make for Sunday dinners when we were children. The irony wasn't lost on me that David had chosen this setting, surrounded by family and childhood memories, to make his final play. I need to address something with all of you, David announced after Sarah had served dessert, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used as the older brother throughout our childhood. Maggie has been making some serious accusations against me, and I think it's important that everyone understands what's really happening here. Sarah looked confused, glancing between us with concern. What kind of accusations? She's claiming that I've been stealing from her, David said, shaking his head sadly. She found some financial documents and immediately jumped to the conclusion that I'm somehow involved in identity theft. That's not what happened, and you know it, I said, my voice remaining calm despite the rage building in my chest. David, you forged my signature on loan applications. You've been using my personal information to obtain credit in my name. Maggie, honey, Linda said gently. Are you sure about this? David's been going through a really tough time lately with work and everything. Maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I pulled the copies of the documents from my purse and spread them across Sarah's dining table. The room fell silent as everyone examined the paperwork. The loan applications, the credit card forms, the bank statements showing payments I'd never authorized. These signatures, Sarah said quietly, holding up one of the applications. Dad, this doesn't look like Aunt Maggie's handwriting at all. Michael, who had been studying the documents with the sharp eye of a college student, majoring in criminal justice, looked up at his father with disappointment that cut deeper than any accusation. Dad, what is this? Did you really forge your Aunt Maggie's signature? David's composure cracked completely. You kids don't understand how the real world works, he snarled. Sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect the people you love. I owe $45,000 to people who don't take no for an answer. They've threatened Sarah. They've threatened all of you. I used Maggie's credit to buy us time. By committing a felony, Michael said flatly. By doing whatever it takes to keep this family safe, David exploded, slamming his fist on the table hard enough to make the dishes jump. Maggie sits in that house with more money than she knows what to do with, while her own brother faces violence and his children are in danger. What kind of family is that? Sarah started to cry. Dad, you didn't tell me you owed money to dangerous people. And you can't just use Aunt Maggie's identity without permission. That's stealing. David turned on her with vicious anger. Don't you dare judge me, Sarah. Everything I've done has been for you. The money I borrowed against Maggie's credit went to paying for your college, your car, your apartment deposit. You've benefited from every penny. I never asked you to commit crimes for me. Sarah sobbed. I would have gotten student loans, worked more hours, found another way. Well, it's too late for that now, David said. Then he turned to me with eyes full of hatred. And you, Maggie, you're going to cooperate with keeping up these loan payments, or everyone in this family is going to suffer the consequences. I stood up from the table, my hands shaking with anger and adrenaline. David, I am not going to be blackmailed by my own brother. What you've done is illegal, and I will not be part of covering it up. He moved so quickly that no one had time to react. One moment he was standing across the table from me, and the next he had grabbed my wrist and twisted it painfully behind my back. You listen to me, you selfish old woman, he hissed in my ear, his grip tightening until I gasped in pain. You're going to keep quiet about this and make those payments, or I promise you'll regret it. David, let her go, Sarah screamed, jumping up from her chair. Michael grabbed his father's arm, trying to force him to release me. Dad, what are you doing? Let go of her right now. But David was beyond reason. He shoved me hard against the wall, and I felt something in my shoulder pop as I hit the plaster. The pain was immediate and intense, but not as devastating as the realization that my own brother was willing to physically assault me to cover up his crimes. I am done being the family disappointment, David shouted at all of us. I am done apologizing for doing whatever it takes to survive. Maggie, you have 24 hours to decide whether you want to be part of the solution or if you want to see this family destroyed. With that, he stormed out of Sarah's apartment, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. But what David didn't know was that I had already made a decision that would change everything. Sitting alone in my living room that Sunday evening, nursing my injured shoulder and replaying David's threat over and over in my mind, something fundamental shifted inside me. For 3 years I had allowed grief and family loyalty to cloud my judgment. I had been the perfect victim, trusting, generous, and passive in the face of escalating manipulation. But watching David physically assault me in front of my own family had crystallized a truth I could no longer ignore. My brother wasn't going to change, and he certainly wasn't going to stop. The clarity that came with this realization was both liberating and terrifying. I was 67 years old, had never been involved with law enforcement beyond parking tickets, and had no experience dealing with financial crimes. But I also wasn't going to spend whatever years I had left living in fear of my own brother, or paying for crimes I didn't commit. Monday morning, I called the number on the business card that had been sitting in my jewelry box for the past 15 years. Detective Ray Morrison had worked Robert's burglary case back in 2010, and we'd stayed in touch through Christmas cards and occasional encounters at the grocery store. At 53, Ray was still sharp, still working financial crimes for the county sheriff's department, and still known for his patient, thorough approach to cases involving elderly victims. "Mrs. Thompson, what a surprise," Ray said when his secretary put my call through. "How have you been since Robert passed?" I was sorry I couldn't make it to the service. "Ray, I'm calling because I need help. I think my brother has been stealing my identity and using it to obtain credit in my name." The tone of his voice changed immediately, becoming more professional and focused. "Ma'am, that's a serious allegation. Can you tell me more about what's happened?" I spent 20 minutes walking Ray through everything. The mysterious envelope, the forged documents, David's confession and subsequent threats, and the physical assault at Sarah's apartment. Ray listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification on dates or dollar amounts. "Mrs. Thompson, what you're describing sounds like familiar fraud, which is unfortunately one of the fastest-growing financial crimes targeting senior citizens. The fact that it's family makes it more complicated emotionally, but legally, it's the same as if a stranger had stolen your identity. What can be done about it? First, we need to document everything. Can you bring me copies of all those documents you found? Second, we need to pull your credit reports from all 3 bureaus to see the full extent of what's been done in your name. Third, we need to file a police report and begin building a case." Director Ray's matter-of-fact approach gave me confidence. This wasn't just a family dispute that needed to be handled privately. It was a crime that required professional intervention. That afternoon, I met Ray at the sheriff's department. He was exactly as I remembered, medium height with graying brown hair, wearing a rumpled tie, and the kind of patient expression that probably put victims at ease. His office was small and cluttered with case files, but he cleared space for me and offered coffee while we reviewed the documents. "Mrs. Thompson, this is extensive," Ray said, spreading the papers across his desk. "This loan application alone shows a sophisticated level of fraud. Someone had access to your social security number, your mother's maiden name, your employment history, even your bank account information. That level of detail strongly suggests someone who's had intimate access to your personal records. What kind of penalties are we talking about if David is convicted?" Identity theft is a felony in this state. Depending on the total amount involved and his prior record, he could be looking at anywhere from 3 to 10 years in prison. But, Mrs. Thompson, I need you to understand that pressing charges against a family member can have consequences beyond the legal system. Are you prepared for that? I thought about David's hands on my wrist, the hatred in his eyes when he called me a selfish old woman, the way he'd tried to manipulate Sarah and the rest of the family into seeing me as the villain. "Detective Morrison, my brother stopped being family the moment he decided to steal my identity and threaten me with violence. I'm prepared for whatever consequences come with doing the right thing." Ray nodded approvingly. "Then let's build a case that will stick." Over the next 3 days, Ray and I worked together to uncover the full scope of David's fraud. The credit reports revealed 4 unauthorized credit cards, 2 personal loans, and a home equity line of credit, all in my name, totaling over $45,000. The pattern was clear. David had been systematically using my information to obtain credit for almost 18 months. But Ray's investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. David hadn't limited his fraud to me. Mrs. Thompson, I've been making some calls to other law enforcement agencies in the county. Your brother's name has come up in connection with at least 3 other cases involving elderly victims. Similar pattern. Family member or friend with access to personal information, gradually escalating financial exploitation. Other victims? A 74-year-old woman named Helen Kowalski, who thought she was helping David's business partner with a short-term loan. An 80-year-old widower, Frank Chen, who David convinced to co-sign for a car loan that Frank thought was for Sarah's college transportation, and possibly others we haven't identified yet. The scope of David's crimes was staggering. This wasn't just a family dispute or a brother having financial troubles. David was a serial predator who specifically targeted elderly people who trusted him. That's when Ray introduced me to someone who would become crucial to our case. Jack Brennan, David's former business partner from the failed lawn care venture. Jack was 55, heavy-set, with calloused hands and the tired eyes of someone who'd learned hard lessons about trust. He met us at a diner near the highway, speaking in low tones and constantly checking over his shoulder. Mrs. Thompson, I've been waiting for someone to catch up with David for over a year now, Jack said, sliding a manila folder across the table. When he told me he had investors lined up for our business, I believed him. But the money he claimed was coming from investors was actually stolen from people like you. The folder contained bank records, forged contracts, and documentation of David's gambling addiction that I'd never known existed. According to Jack, David had been frequenting illegal poker games and online betting sites, losing thousands of dollars every week. The lawn care business was never real, Jack explained. It was just a cover story he used to explain where the money was coming from. He owed bookmakers all over the state, and they were starting to make serious threats. That's when he started getting desperate and sloppy. How sloppy? Ray asked. He tried to get me to sign documents using fake names and social security numbers. When I refused, he said he'd just do it himself. He bragged about how easy it was to fool banks when you had family members who trusted you completely. Jack's testimony would be crucial for establishing David's pattern of fraud and his motive for committing these crimes. But more importantly, Jack agreed to help us set up a situation where David would incriminate himself. What did you have in mind? I asked Ray. Your family has a tradition of gathering for Thanksgiving dinner, correct? Every year at Sarah's apartment. Perfect. We're going to give David enough rope to hang himself, and we're going to do it in front of witnesses who can testify to his confession. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would contact David and tell him that I'd decided to cooperate with his demands, that I was scared of the people he owed money to, and willing to keep making payments on the fraudulent loans. This would hopefully make him overconfident and willing to discuss the details of his crimes openly. Ray would be recording everything from an adjoining room, and Jack would attend the dinner as my guest. Someone David wouldn't suspect had already turned against him. The key, Ray explained, is to get him talking about the specific crimes he's committed, the other victims he's defrauded, and his threats against you. Once he admits to the details in front of witnesses, we'll have enough to make an arrest that will stick. As November approached and our Thanksgiving trap was set, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The power that comes from refusing to be a victim. The perfect moment had finally arrived. Thanksgiving Day arrived gray and cold, with the first frost of the season coating Sarah's apartment complex parking lot. I sat in my Honda Civic for several minutes before going inside, rehearsing the performance Ray and I had planned. The key was to appear beaten down, resigned to David's demands, while secretly recording every incriminating word that came out of his mouth. The wire Ray had fitted under my cardigan was barely noticeable, but I could feel the small recording device taped to my ribs with every breath. Detective Morrison was positioned in the apartment next door, listening to everything through a receiver and ready to move in when we had enough evidence for an arrest warrant. Jack Brennan had arrived 30 minutes earlier, playing his role as my concerned friend who'd offered to accompany me to what I'd described as a difficult family dinner. To David, Jack would appear to be moral support for an elderly woman who'd finally agreed to cooperate with her brother's criminal scheme. Sarah answered the door with red eyes and a forced smile. She'd aged years in the weeks since learning about her father's crimes, and I could see the weight of family shame in the way she carried herself. "Aunt Maggie, I'm so glad you came," she whispered, embracing me carefully to avoid my still healing shoulder. "Dad's been different lately, more anxious. I think he's worried about what you might do." "Everything's going to be fine, sweetie," I assured her, though we both knew nothing would ever be the same again. David was standing by the window when I entered Sarah's living room, his posture rigid and his hands clenched behind his back. He'd dressed up for the occasion in a button-down shirt and slacks, but the clothes couldn't hide the toll that stress and guilt had taken on his appearance. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his hair looked like he'd been running his fingers through it compulsively. "Maggie," he said, turning toward me with what he probably thought was a welcoming smile. "I wasn't sure you'd come. We're family, David. Despite everything, we're still family." The words felt like poison in my mouth, but they had the desired effect. David's shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time in weeks, he looked genuinely hopeful. Jack shook hands with David, introducing himself as my neighbor, who'd been helping me through all this financial confusion. David barely paid attention to him, too focused on what he saw as his victory over my resistance. Dinner was a strained affair. Sarah had prepared all the traditional dishes, but conversation was stilted and artificial. Michael, who had driven down from college, kept shooting suspicious glances at his father. Linda, David's ex-wife, seemed uncomfortable being included in what everyone knew was more than a family meal. It wasn't until after dessert, when Sarah was clearing dishes in the kitchen, that David finally felt confident enough to discuss business. "Maggie, I want to thank you for coming to your senses about our situation," he began, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "I know it was hard to accept that sometimes family has to make sacrifices for the greater good. I've been thinking about what you said, David, about the dangerous people you owe money to and what might happen if the loans don't get paid." "Exactly. See, I knew you'd understand once you had time to think rationally about it. These aren't the kind of people who accept excuses or payment plans. They want their money, and they don't care where it comes from." Jack leaned forward, playing his part perfectly. "David, can I ask how you ended up owing so much money to dangerous people?" Maggie mentioned it was around $45,000. David's chest puffed up with what looked like pride. "Actually, it's more than that now with interest. Probably closer to $60,000 total. I got in over my head with some high-stakes poker games, and then tried to win it back through online betting. Bad decisions, but what's done is done." "And you used Maggie's identity to get loans to cover the gambling debts?" "I used credit that was available through the family," David corrected, not seeming to realize he was confessing to multiple felonies. "Maggie had perfect credit and no debt. It made sense to borrow against that credit temporarily while I got my situation sorted out." I forced myself to nod along. "David, I need to understand exactly what you did, so I know what payments I'm responsible for going forward." This was the moment we'd been waiting for. David, believing he'd finally broken my will, began detailing his crimes with the casual confidence of someone who thought he'd gotten away with everything. "Well, the first thing I did was get copies of your Social Security card and birth certificate from your filing cabinet. That was easy because you'd given me a key for emergencies. Then I needed samples of your signature, so I started collecting your old checks and documents whenever I visited. How did you forge the signatures well enough to fool the banks? Practice, David said, actually laughing. I spent hours copying your handwriting until I could do it without thinking. The trick is using the right kind of pen and signing with confidence. Bank tellers see hundreds of signatures every day. They're not handwriting experts. Michael, who had been silent throughout this conversation, suddenly spoke up. Dad, what you're describing is identity theft. That's a federal crime. David waved dismissively at his son. It's borrowing from family with the intention of paying it back. Besides, what prosecutor is going to waste time on a case where the victim is cooperating and no one got hurt? But Dad, other people did get hurt, Michael said quietly. What about Mrs. Kowalski? What about Mr. Chen? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David's confident expression faltered as he realized he'd never told his family about his other victims. What about Mrs. Kowalski? I asked, even though Ray and I already knew the answer. David's face went pale. I don't know what Michael is talking about. Yes, you do, Michael pressed on, his voice gaining strength. Mrs. Kowalski called me last week. She said you'd convinced her to co-sign on a loan for what you told her was Sarah's graduate school tuition. She's been making payments for 8 months on a loan that had nothing to do with Sarah. And Mr. Chen, Sarah added, appearing in the doorway with tears streaming down her face. His grandson goes to my college. He told me his grandfather has been making car payments for a car that doesn't exist because you convinced him you needed help buying me reliable transportation. David stood up abruptly, his chair falling backward. You kids don't understand the pressure I was under. Those people were going to hurt all of us if I didn't pay them back. I did what I had to do to protect this family. By stealing from elderly people who trusted you? Linda asked, speaking for the first time all evening. David, how could you justify that to yourself? The same way I justified everything else, David exploded. By putting family first. By doing whatever it takes to keep the people I love safe and secure. Maggie has more money than she'll ever need, and those other people, they were happy to help when they thought it was for Sarah. But it wasn't for Sarah, I said quietly. It was for your gambling addiction. It was for survival, David shouted. You think I wanted to be in this position? You think I enjoyed having to lie and scheme and borrow just to keep myself alive? But that's what the real world is like, Maggie. That's what happens when you don't have the luxury of sitting in a big house collecting pension checks and feeling superior to everyone else. The hatred in his voice was unmistakable now, and I realized that David had probably resented me for years before Robert's death gave him the opportunity to act on that resentment. David, Jack said calmly, it sounds like you're saying you intentionally defrauded multiple elderly victims to pay gambling debts. Is that accurate? I'm saying I did whatever was necessary to survive, and I'd do it again if I had to. That's when Detective Morrison and 2 uniformed officers entered through Sarah's front door, which she had left unlocked according to our plan. David Thompson, you're under arrest for identity theft, fraud, and elder abuse. The look of shock and betrayal on David's face as the handcuffs clicked into place was something I'll never forget. Maggie, what did you do? I did what I should have done the moment I found that envelope. I reported a crime to the police, but the best part was still to come. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut on David's wrists seemed to echo through Sarah's apartment, followed by a silence so complete that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. David's face had gone from shocked to furious to desperate in the span of 30 seconds, his eyes darting between the officers, me, and the rest of our family, as if looking for someone to rescue him from the consequences of his own actions. Maggie, you can't do this to me, David pleaded as Detective Morrison read him his rights. I'm your brother. We can work this out as a family. You don't understand what will happen to me in prison. David Thompson, you have the right to remain silent," Detective Morrison continued, his voice calm and professional. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Sarah collapsed onto her couch, sobbing into her hands. "Dad, how could you do this to all those people? How could you lie to me about where the money was coming from?" Michael stood frozen by the window, watching his father being processed for arrest with the kind of horrified fascination reserved for witnessing something you never thought you'd see. Linda, meanwhile, had gone pale and was gripping the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "You have the right to an attorney," Detective Morrison continued. "If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." But David wasn't listening to his rights. He was staring at me with undisguised hatred, his lips moving in what I assumed were curses too vile to speak aloud in front of his children. "Maggie, this isn't over," he said, as the officers began to lead him toward the door. "You think you've won something here, but you have no idea what you've just unleashed. There are people who are going to come looking for their money, and when they do, they won't care that I'm in jail. They'll come after my family." "Dad, stop," Michael said quietly. "Just stop talking and get a lawyer." As the officers guided David through Sarah's front door, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or relief, but a profound sadness for the brother I'd lost years ago, without realizing it. The person being led away in handcuffs wasn't the little boy who'd shared my childhood, or even the troubled man who'd needed help after Robert's funeral. He was a stranger who'd systematically betrayed every person who'd ever trusted him. The apartment fell silent again after the police car pulled away. Sarah was still crying, but more quietly now, and Michael had moved to sit beside her on the couch. Linda stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, clearly uncertain whether she should stay or leave. "Aunt Maggie," Sarah said finally, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea Dad was stealing from you and those other people. If I'd known where the money for my college and my car was really coming from." "Sweetheart, this isn't your fault," I assured her, sitting down across from her and reaching for her hands. "You didn't know what your father was doing. None of us did, not fully. But I should have questioned it," Michael said, his voice thick with guilt. "When Dad suddenly had money for Sarah's tuition and my dorm expenses, I should have asked where it was coming from. I knew he was struggling financially, but I just accepted that he'd figured something out." Jack, who had remained quietly in the background throughout the arrest, finally spoke up. "David was very good at making people believe what he wanted them to believe. He convinced me that your family had money to invest in our business. He showed me what looked like legitimate financial documents. I didn't realize until months later that everything he'd shown me was forged." Over the next hour, as we sat in Sarah's living room processing what had just happened, the full scope of David's crimes began to emerge through a series of phone calls. Detective Morrison called to inform me that 3 more elderly victims had come forward since David's arrest became public that evening. Mrs. Helen Kowalski, the 74-year-old Polish immigrant who lived across town, had been making payments on a $15,000 personal loan that David had convinced her was for Sarah's graduate school tuition. She'd never even met Sarah, but David had shown her forged acceptance letters and financial aid documents that made the story seem legitimate. Frank Chen, the 80-year-old widower from Elm Street, had co-signed for what he believed was a car loan to help Sarah get reliable transportation for her job interviews. The car didn't exist, but Frank had been faithfully making $300 monthly payments for over a year. Most shocking of all was Eleanor Manning, an 85-year-old woman with early-stage dementia, whose grandson had discovered that she'd given David access to her checking account after he'd convinced her that he was helping to manage her finances as a favor to her late husband, who had supposedly been David's friend. The total amount we're looking at now is over $127,000, Detective Morrison told me during his call. David systematically targeted elderly people in the community who were either isolated, dealing with cognitive decline, or going through grief. He identified vulnerable people and exploited their trust. The thought of David preying on confused, lonely elderly people made me physically sick. This wasn't just a family dispute about money. David was a predator who had spent years perfecting his techniques for manipulating and stealing from the most vulnerable members of our community. Within days of David's arrest, the consequences for him began piling up like an avalanche. The district attorney's office announced they were charging him with 12 felony counts of identity theft, 6 counts of elder abuse, 3 counts of fraud, and 2 counts of money laundering. If convicted on all counts, David was facing a potential sentence of 25 to 40 years in prison. Sarah received a call from David's public defender explaining that, while the family could visit him in jail, any money deposited in his commissary account might be seized as part of restitution efforts for his victims. The lawyer also warned that David's criminal trial would likely be highly publicized due to the number of elderly victims involved. But perhaps the most immediate consequence came from an unexpected source. Sarah's landlord called to inform her that David's name was on her lease as a co-signer, and his arrest for financial crimes meant that she would need to find a new guarantor or face eviction. Sarah, who had just started her new job, didn't have the credit history or income to qualify for the apartment on her own. "I don't know what I'm going to do," Sarah confessed to me during one of our daily phone calls in the weeks following David's arrest. "I can't afford to move, but I can't afford to stay either. And everywhere I go, people are talking about Dad and what he did. I feel like everyone's staring at me, wondering if I was part of it." Michael was facing similar challenges at college. Word of his father's crimes had somehow reached his campus, and he was dealing with questions from classmates and professors who'd heard about the case through local news coverage. His part-time job at a local bank was also in jeopardy, as financial institutions typically avoid employing people with family members who have criminal records for financial crimes. The ripple effects of David's actions extended far beyond his immediate family. Mrs. Kowalski, who had been struggling financially even before David's fraud, was now facing bankruptcy and the potential loss of her home. Frank Chen's grandson set up a crowdfunding campaign to help cover his grandfather's fraudulent car payments. But the emotional toll of being victimized had left the elderly man reluctant to leave his house or trust anyone outside his family. Eleanor Manning's family had begun legal proceedings to place her in a conservatorship after discovering that David's access to her finances was just the tip of the iceberg. She had been the victim of multiple scams over the past year, losing nearly her entire life savings to various criminals who had identified her as an easy target. 3 weeks after David's arrest, I received a letter from him that had been forwarded through his lawyer. The handwriting was shaky, and the tone was dramatically different from the confident, manipulative man who had threatened me in Sarah's apartment. "Maggie," the letter began, "I know you'll probably throw this away without reading it, but I need you to know that I never meant for things to go this far. I got in over my head with gambling, and once I owed those people money, everything just spiraled out of control. I thought I could pay everyone back before anyone got hurt. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I need you to understand that I was trying to protect my family, not hurt them." The letter went on for 3 pages, alternating between apologies, justifications, and pleas for me to somehow intervene on his behalf with the prosecutor's office. But what struck me most was the final paragraph. "I've lost everything now. My freedom, my family, my self-respect. Was it worth it to you, seeing your own brother destroyed like this? Was your money really more important than family? Even facing decades in prison, David was still trying to make me feel guilty for his choices, still attempting to manipulate me into believing that reporting his crimes had somehow made me the villain in this story. I never wrote back. 1 year later, the full consequences of David's actions had become clear for everyone involved. 1 year after that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, I find myself sitting in the same kitchen where I discovered the envelope that changed everything. But my life has been transformed in ways I never could have imagined. The morning sun streams through windows that I now keep unlocked during the day, and my coffee tastes sweeter, knowing that I no longer live in fear of my own brother's next scheme or demand. David was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Henley, called his crimes a systematic campaign of exploitation against the most vulnerable members of our community, and noted that his victims included people he had specifically targeted because of their age, isolation, and trustful nature. The courtroom was packed that day with his victims and their families, many of whom gave victim impact statements that left not a dry eye in the room. Sarah moved in with me 3 months after her father's sentencing, when her lease expired and she couldn't find another apartment she could afford on her graphic designer salary. At first, we both worried the arrangement might be awkward or temporary, but it has become one of the most rewarding relationships of my later years. Having her laughter fill the house again, seeing her art supplies scattered across the dining room table, and sharing meals with someone who genuinely enjoys my company has brought a vitality to my life that I hadn't realized I was missing. Sarah has thrived professionally since distancing herself from her father's shadow. Her design work caught the attention of a marketing firm in the city, and she now commutes to a job that pays nearly double her previous salary. More importantly, she has found peace in understanding that she bears no responsibility for her father's choices, a lesson that took months of counseling and family conversations to fully accept. Michael finished his criminal justice degree and is now working with the district attorney's office as a victim advocate, specifically focusing on elder fraud cases. He says that watching his father's crimes unfold and seeing the impact on victims like me inspired him to dedicate his career to preventing and prosecuting financial crimes against seniors. Last month, he helped secure convictions against 3 people who had been running romance scams, targeting widowed elderly women through online dating sites. The restitution process has been more successful than Detective Morrison initially predicted. David's confession and cooperation with authorities helped recover nearly 80% of the stolen funds. Mrs. Kowalski was able to keep her house, Frank Chen's grandson was reimbursed for all the fraudulent car payments, and Eleanor Manning's family established a trust fund to protect her remaining assets. The State Victim Compensation Fund covered most of the remaining losses, though the emotional toll on all of us will take much longer to heal. My own financial situation actually improved significantly through an unexpected development. The media attention surrounding David's case brought my story to the attention of a victims' rights organization that helps elderly fraud victims navigate insurance claims and financial recovery. With their assistance, I discovered that my homeowner's insurance policy included identity theft coverage that I'd never known existed. The insurance settlement, combined with the restitution payments, meant that I not only recovered all my losses, but actually ended up in a stronger financial position than before David's crimes began. More importantly, I've learned lessons about myself and about family that have changed how I approach relationships and boundaries. I used to believe that loving someone meant never questioning their motives or saying no to their requests. Now I understand that real love sometimes requires the courage to refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal is painful for everyone involved. I've become something of an accidental expert on elder fraud prevention, speaking at senior centers and community organizations about recognizing the warning signs of financial exploitation. Detective Morrison often invites me to share my story at law enforcement training sessions, and I've testified before the state legislature in support of stronger penalties for crimes targeting elderly victims. The most rewarding aspect of this work has been connecting with other families who've experienced similar betrayals. There's a support group that meets monthly at our community center, and I've formed deep friendships with people who understand the unique pain of being victimized by someone you trusted completely. We've learned that family fraud is far more common than most people realize, and that shame often prevents victims from seeking help or reporting crimes. Emma, my neighbor who first alerted me to David's suspicious behavior, has become my closest friend and partner in what we jokingly call our Senior Detective Agency. Together we've helped 3 other elderly neighbors identify and report financial scams targeting them. Emma's sharp eye for detail and my hard-won experience with family fraud make us an effective team for spotting suspicious activity in our community. The house feels different now, too. Where I once felt isolated and vulnerable, I now feel secure and purposeful. Sarah's presence brings energy and youth, but more than that, it represents the possibility of healthy family relationships built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than manipulation and exploitation. David writes to me occasionally from prison, letters that alternate between apologies, justifications, and requests for money for his commissary account. I don't respond to these letters, but I don't throw them away either. They serve as a reminder of how thoroughly addiction and desperation can corrupt someone's moral compass, and how important it is to maintain firm boundaries with people who refuse to take responsibility for their actions. Sarah asked me once if I ever regret turning David into the police, if there's any part of me that wishes I had handled things differently. The answer is complicated. I grieve for the brother I thought I knew, and I'm sad that our family was torn apart by his choices. But I don't regret protecting myself and other potential victims from further harm. David's crimes weren't victimless mistakes. They were calculated attacks on vulnerable people who trusted him. If anything, I regret not recognizing the warning signs earlier. I regret allowing grief and loneliness to cloud my judgment for so long. I regret that it took finding that envelope in my glove compartment to realize that family loyalty should never come at the expense of personal safety or financial security. The most important lesson I've learned is that age doesn't make you weak or naive. Experience makes you wise enough to recognize patterns and trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it usually is wrong. When someone's explanations don't add up, it's okay to ask difficult questions. When family members or friends make demands that compromise your security or well-being, it's not only acceptable to refuse, it's necessary. Today, as I write this story, David has 8 more years to serve on his sentence. Sarah is planning to use her savings to buy a house near mine, where we can be neighbors rather than roommates. Michael calls every Sunday, and we talk about his work, his girlfriend, and his hopes for a future free from his father's criminal legacy. I'm 68 now, healthier and happier than I was at 67, surrounded by people who love me without expecting anything in return, except the same honest affection I give them. My identity may have been stolen once, but I've reclaimed not just my name and credit rating. I've reclaimed my sense of self-worth, my personal boundaries, and my faith in my own judgment. If you've experienced something similar, or if you recognize the warning signs in your own family relationships, I encourage you to trust your instincts and seek help. Financial exploitation by family members is a crime, not a private family matter. You deserve to feel safe and respected, regardless of your age or your relationship to the person who is hurting you. And remember, protecting yourself from people who would exploit your kindness isn't selfish. It's necessary. It's brave. And it's the foundation for building the kind of authentic, healthy relationships that make life worth living, no matter how many years you have left to enjoy them.